Um, Today we're going to interview a veteran by the name of Doug Bissett, and he's served back in the 60s. And my name is Paul Julian, and I have my partner here, Joe Davey. We're going to interview Doug, this is the February 16th of 2023. We're at the Veterans Memorial Center in Merritt Island, and other than that, how we're going to plan to do this is we're going to have Doug, who's done his story in different venues or different settings. We're going to let Doug go ahead and give us his story, and if myself or Joe feel there's something that we need to ask him about, then we'll do so. So go ahead, Doug.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Paul. Doug Bissett, as Paul introduced me. My full name, Marvin Douglas Bissett. I was born in 1947 in the shadow of World War II. And I think that kind of background led to my military experience in the end, and so it's worthwhile talking about a little bit about the family history from World War II. Every single male member of my family was served in World War II. I've got top to bottom, I've got my grandfather, who was Commodore in the Seabees in the Navy, and he was in all the Pacific Theater, built all the airstrips to as we marched towards victory with the Japanese. My father was Andrew Bissett also, and he was Marine Corps artillery, and he fought in the Pacific during World War II as well. There's a famous picture of the two of them, my grandfather and my father, who were both fighting in the Battle of Okinawa toward the end of the war, and they took an official military photograph of the two of them. My grandfather at the time was in charge of all the Seabees on the island and built all the airstrips. My father was in charge of division artillery that fought the Japanese on the island of Okinawa, and ultimately, when the war ended, he came home. Also, I had two uncles that were in the submarine service, and one of them died from circular torpedo that slammed into his submarine, and he expired, but they both served in the Pacific during the war. I also had my Uncle Phil, who was in the Army Air Corps, flying in B-29 bombers that were bombing Japan. So I had quite a lot of background, a lot of stories, and certainly, although I wasn't a military brat, my father was, and I certainly had a lot of my grandfather during the time as I grew up. So it was really a heavy Navy background that led to what I ultimately did. So with that, I went to college in 1965 to 69, and it was in the era of the worst point of the Vietnam War. There was a lot of friction going on in the country. The draft was still going strong. A lot of protests were going on, including at my college, Lafayette College in Easton, Pennsylvania. It was a very unpopular war at the time. There was a lottery going on, so that the lottery envisioned, getting a number, and if you were at a certain level, you got drafted, and if you weren't, you got excused from military service. My brother at the time was 2 years ahead of me, and he joined the Navy and ultimately became a Navy SEAL, and he was a careerist in the Navy, so again, a lot of influence from my family. I determined when I was in college that the best way for me to serve my country and to do my part was through the ROTC program at Lafayette, and that was an Army ROTC program, so I was like the dark sheep of the family. All my Navy family was, but I did serve as in the Army, and that was because they had Army ROTC at that college. So, and it was my decision to learn that all I could. If I was going to go to Vietnam, I wanted to learn everything I could possibly learn about how to survive during the war. So that was my mission at the time. I was a history major in college, so a lot of history has been my background, and that's partly why I work here at the Veterans Center. So as I said, I was at Lafayette College from '65 to '69, as during the height of the Vietnam War, and a lot of friction was going on. All the colleges were protesting, etc. The way ROTC worked in college was the first 2 years were required for everyone. It was an all-male college. The first 2 years of ROTC were part of your curriculum to give you a taste of what the ROTC program was all about. It was an introduction on military subjects and drill, etc. And then the second 2 years of your college experience was called the Advanced ROTC program, and that was elective. So I decided, and that was a contract. Once I decided I was going to go into the advanced program, I signed a contract with the military. You served the rest of the time in the ROTC program, but then you were obligated for 2 years of active duty in a 6-year term of reserve, Army Reserve. The other 4 years, 2 years of inactive reserve and 2 years of active reserve. So a total of a 6-year commitment if you signed up for the advanced ROTC program. Also during that 2-year period, you went to Army boot camp in the summer for about a month. It might have been a little longer, I can't remember, but that was at Indiantown Gap in Pennsylvania, and that's a big old World War I, huge, expansive military base that's in the mountains in western Pennsylvania. That was an interesting experience. The best part of it for me was that I was a great shot on the rifle range with an M14. I had experience as a youth. My father taught me to shoot bats in the barn of our house, and so I was pretty familiar with weapons from him having been in the Marine Corps. So during that experience at ROTC summer camp, I was the top shot in the battalion of 2,000 men, which garnered me a big trophy, and I got in the parade. I all marched in the parade for me among some of the other awards that were given. I got the top shot award, which led me to think that the Army's going to come after me to go in a sniper school or something like that, but it never turned out that way. So I was commissioned a second lieutenant at the end of the 4-year period, and interestingly enough, there were 90 commissioned officers from my class at the time. It was the highest number of ROTC cadets in the ROTC program at the college at the time. So it was a huge number that were that had gotten into the program. So I was 23 years old at the time, and it was a pretty heady experience for me. Yes.
About what year was it, Doug?
This was 1969. 1969. So the other interesting thing was the branch choice. The ROTC program, the Army had 13 branches at the time. Now, apparently now it's 26 branches, different branches of the military. And because Vietnam was so destructive, when I went early in the ROTC program, you were told you had 3 choices. One had to be a combat arms being infantry, artillery, armor, signal, and Army engineers. The other branches were support branches. By the time I was a senior, you had to choose 2 combat arms out of the 3 choices. So they were they were losing so many officers in Vietnam that they were upping the ante on your combat arms choices. So at the time I chose armor because of George Patton in artillery because of my father, and then I threw in transportation as my third choice, not knowing really much about it. And of all things, I was assigned to transportation, so I was totally surprised at that, but that's what they gave me. During my ROTC program, I was captain of the Ranger Company. I was a distinguished military student, and I got the award at the college as well for the rifle program. So it was a delay after college graduation until I got into the military. My active duty period was, so I got graduated in May of '69 and didn't start till February of 1970. And in the Transportation Corps, when this flag is the transportation symbol, transportation, Army transportation really encompasses 4 different disciplines: trucks and trains, boats and planes. So, in fact, interestingly enough, the Army's boat program is so huge that they had more boats than the Navy. So that was kind of an interesting analogy. This was all at Fort Eustis, Virginia, which is in Newport News, Virginia. It also encompassed Fort Story, which was the amphibious part of the ROTC program. I mean, not ROTC, but the transportation school program. You go into your advanced schooling when you go to the transportation school. It's called the TOBAC program, the Transportation Officer Basic Course. And I forget how long it was. It was a month or 2 of advanced training in your specialty, which was transportation school. When I got out of that, of all things, I was assigned as an instructor in the transportation school. So I wound up being an instructor teaching transportation.
Hey, Doug, was there any particular, as far as like 101 transportation, what kind of subject did they have? Did they talk about? Because I know talking with you before, you did a whole host of stuff when you were in Korea.
Right, and I'll take you through that because, interestingly enough, as I said, there's trucks and trains, boats and planes. So trucks is being truck transport, trains, believe it or not, at the transportation school they had the last train battalion that we were taught how to manage a train program. Planes was ultimately really was the big program. That was the helicopter program, and all these guys that were pilots were going to Vietnam. So there was a big active part that was in helicopters, including helicopter maintenance. And then there was boats, which was where I got assigned. Now, what I did was I taught stevedoring and documentation. You know, the boat program is like, stevedoring is like how to load and unload ships. So here you got a photograph of the Victory ship that was being used to train individuals on how to load and offload ships. And here's here's myself working with the winches. So we're practicing loading the holds of cargo in and out of a Victory ship, this big old rusty Victory ship. But that was the training ship that we used. So it's a World War II Victory ship that was being used to train. Here's a photograph of, you know, the crane that hauled the break bulk cargo and dropped into the hold itself at the transportation school. Now, because we had all these other boats, a lot of what they called logistics over the shore operations, they used landing craft. This was called an LCM-8, landing craft mechanized, which is what you see in the movies where they're going ashore, the Marines or in the Army going ashore and they drop the ramp and go ashore. Well, these boats were also used for amphibious landing on beaches in remote areas or what have you.
Kind of like a Higgins.
Yeah, like it is. Maybe it is a Higgins boat. I don't even know, but it's called an LCM-8, and we transported cargo ashore, you know, into beachheads and stuff with these operations. So we were teaching how to operate, you know, a program for beach operations called LOTS, Logistics Over the Shore Operations. We also had amphibious landing craft, which is, some people have seen what these are. Is this upside down or sideways? And these actually had wheels, so they'd go ashore with a propeller and then bring the cargo ashore and then grind up into inland and, could pull cargo off them that way. So that's a lot of what they did at Fort Story. We practiced coming ashore with amphibious landing craft. So we also were involved in convoy duty. Here's a convoy of trucks, usually 2.5 and 5 ton trucks. Like one example, like we have out here in the plaza at the Veterans Center, hauling lots of cargo with trucks at the time. I wasn't involved in trucks only during the training because my focus was in stevedoring and documentation, which is what I taught. Just showing this is what the transportation school had when we did practice that.
Did they have, going back to, did they have like longshoremen?
Well, we would teach enlisted men and those others how to manage those programs. Yeah, that's right, exactly. And this is just a picture of the Army train in the transportation school. There is actually an Army train, so they were still training for any kind of a European operation that might take place. Of course, we never did do that. We certainly didn't do that in Vietnam. So, but we did get taught that. But I wasn't involved in the teaching of that kind of program. So I spent a year at Fort Eustis training others in documentation and loading ships and break bulk cargo and logistics over the shore operations. So that was my job as instructor at Fort Eustis. So then, while I was there, I got my orders for overseas. Everybody in the class 2 weeks before ours wound up going to Vietnam. Everybody in the class 2 weeks after our class went to Vietnam. My class was chosen to go replace another class in Korea. So I got orders to Korea. I'll never forget that. I called my mother. I was single at the time. Said, "Mom, I'm going to Korea." And she said, "Oh no, I can't believe you're going to Korea." Going, "Where's that?" So I didn't know where it was, but certainly it was certainly a breath of fresh air to not have to go to Vietnam during that period, because we had 400,000 guys getting and going through that meat grinder at the time. And so I went to Korea and replaced other guys. So I wound up with a 6-month delay before I actually got to travel overseas to Korea. But when I landed in February, I got placed in Inchon, Korea, at the 202nd Transportation Battalion. Now, a little backdrop on Korea, just so people understand where I was and what I did. I've got a good map of Korea here, and I was stationed in Inchon, which is just south of the 38th parallel, which is the dividing line between North Korea and South Korea. And North Korea is where the bad guys are, and they still are there. We were there 15 years after the Korean War, and the Korean War was devastating for the Korea. I'll come back to this map, but the Korean War was devastating for the Koreans because the North Koreans invaded, and this map shows where the Korean invasion went all the way. It took over the entire South Korean country all the way down to what's called the Pusan Perimeter. It was the last part down here at the base of the peninsula, trying to completely take over and unify the country under communism at the time. So I point this out because what it did was devastate the middle of the country. It was a good photograph here of what was left of Seoul, Korea, which is the capital of the country, totally devastated because it got invaded 4 times. The North Koreans invaded to the south. We pushed them back to North Korea. The Chinese invaded and pushed back through Seoul again, and then we pushed back through Seoul a 4th time, so it got totally obliterated. But subsequent to that, Korea has come back very nicely. It's a good photograph of like what Seoul, Korea looks like today. So we did a good job, and we're still there, and we're supporting a great democracy in this crazy world. So back to this map, I think it's important to point out that Inchon, during the invasion, during the Korean War, was the point where some people remember where MacArthur did the end around on the North Koreans, and he invaded through Inchon, where I was stationed. Now the problem with Inchon is it has 30-foot tides. You try to imagine 30-foot tides. It's the second highest in the world in terms of tide height and depth. So the problem with the port of Inchon was that we had to do two-step operation. You had to unload the ships offshore onto barges, bring the cargo in on the barges, and go through a lock into the port where we operated. And so the lock was here. You brought the barges in and then closed the lock so that you'd keep the water level up. So it was a very encumbersome and costly, time-consuming effort. And ultimately, the place got closed down. I was the last officer to leave at the end of my tour. The entrance to the locks, here's a good photograph that shows the entrance to the locks going in. Tugboats would tow in the barges with the cargo and unload them in the lock area on the backside of the lock in the basin there, as I showed, and we'd store things in warehouses until we transported it north to the demilitarized zone where the 8th Army had all our troops. This is an example of what it's like to be a 23-year-old working on a documentation role in South Korea. Notice I'm still wearing that uniform proudly. I can still fit after 50-something years, and that's what it looked like operating at my desk. Now we had 6 tugboats, 4 that were 65-footers and 2 100-foot tugboats. And there's me just touring around one of the tugboats when I was in between doing things. But that's what it all looked like. Tugboats were really important, obviously, for bringing that cargo ashore. This is an example of the kind of cargo that we brought out. Here's a stack of armor personnel carriers that were pulled off ships and brought in on barges to go ashore. Here's another example of cargo. If you can look closely, those are all pallets of Pabst Blue Ribbon beer that's coming ashore on the barges. Now we had a 100-ton floating crane that actually brought the. What did I do with that picture? I'll find it. We had a 100-ton floating crane that would take those armor personnel carriers or tanks off of ships. So that was pretty impressive. We had a scout boat that I would sometimes utilize to go out and do inspections of ships offshore. It was a nice little Army's Navy. It's a nice little thing that I got to utilize every now and then. Here's an example of that we would load old Japanese railway with equipment to send up to the DMZ or use trucks. This was lashing equipment onto a flatbed in the railroad heading north. This is a picture of some of the stevedores that we hired, all indigenous personnel. They were all Koreans. You could see how old this guy was. They were really hungry there. It was 15 years after the war, so they were glad to have jobs. The place was really poor, and people were really glad to have jobs working for the military. Here's trucks being loaded to go up to the northern end of Korea, which was the other way we brought things in and out. So either by rail or by truck was the primary way to move equipment up to the demilitarized zone for the 8th Army. So I was part of what's called Korea Support Command, and this is the patch that I wore at the time. Korea Support Command. I was part of the 8th Army that had 2nd Division up north that were on the demilitarized zone, the infantry, etc. There's a photograph of myself and some of the other officers that were involved in the operation. in the port of Inchon. Here's a picture of some of the people that worked for me. I had over 100 people that worked for me, all varieties, all shapes and sizes. We were colorblind. We believed in colorblind. People would do their jobs and get rated by their contribution. Everybody got along. Probably over half of the people that worked for me were Koreans, didn't speak a word of English, so we had a lot of interpretation issues. That we had interpreters that would help us to manage the process. This is one of the sergeants that worked for me. They were the ones that kept me out of trouble. They did the heavy duty work. This was the installation, transportation part of the job. My tasks were multiple. So it's interesting when you think about being a 23-year-old in charge of 100 people, and you had multiple tasks to manage in that process. It was really growing up fast, I'll call it. I was the port documentation officer, the installation transportation officer, which was managing all the home goods for military people that were in Korea moving in and out. We were in charge of their automobiles if they had them, and their home goods, when you were shipping stuff back and forth back to the States. I was the customs clearance officer, so anything that moved in and out of the port had to go through me. I had to clear it, make sure it was legitimate. I was also the payroll officer, which was an interesting role because we paid our Koreans all in cash, and I had to go to a supply depot, which was nearly an hour drive by Jeep, to pick up a trunkload of cash in Korean money in big bricks of 500 won notes. And it was an open Jeep with one armed guard with me and my 45 sidearm, and I'm driving through all these really poor areas of Korea with probably several $1,000s in Korean money just sitting there in a steamer trunk in the back of the Jeep. Scared the hell out of me, but I was told that the Koreans would never knock off a Jeep that was a payroll Jeep for whatever reason, because I guess they would all go after whoever it was that would perpetrate that. But when I think of the armored cars we use in the United States, and I was in an open-air Jeep with one guy with a rifle, I just found that scary as hell. So anyway, I was the payroll officer. One interesting side note of being a payroll officer, when we paid the Koreans, we'd have to break down those 500 won notes to give you an idea of the exchange rate. So a US dollar was worth 365 Korean won. So there was a huge proportion of difference in denomination. So we paid in big numbers of Korean won. And those got broken down by a group of Koreans that would break down the amounts, distribute them all to all of the Koreans. They would come in, I'd pass out the envelopes. They would fill the envelopes, but they would use it. They would break down the amounts and figure it all out using an abacus. If you know what an abacus is, it's all those little beads going back and forth on this little tray thing. And that's how they counted it up, and they always got it exactly right. So they break down several $1,000s worth of won into little envelopes for all the people that worked for me, a lot of typists, a lot of different people in the documentation section or all over the port, and pay the Koreans. They put them in these little envelopes, and then I would pass them out as they'd come in and get paid. And thank God they always got it right, because I had no idea how they were working all those numbers.
About, Doug, approximately how many would you have to pay at any one?
Well, I had at least 50 of my own, and then I paid other Koreans that worked in some of the other areas, because I was the payroll officer. So maybe 75 to 100 I would pay at any given time.
And would it all be in
we paid
won?
them once a month, I think it was.
All in Korean currency?
All in Korean currency. But they always got it with those abacus. Those guys would break it down, and they got it right down to almost down to the nickel or whatever the exchange amount was.
Yeah.
And if I had to chip in a few bucks, I didn't care. I was so happy that they could figure it all out. I just thought it was fascinating to watch.
Yeah.
Anyway, that was one of my side jobs. Secondary jobs I had was I was officer of the watch. I'd go down at night and go around the port facility to make sure that there were no break-ins, make sure that the guards that were on guard duty were doing what they were supposed to do on the perimeter with guard dogs. We had guard dogs, which I'll describe in a minute. I was a legal defense counsel if enlisted men got in trouble and we had to go before the military justice. I ended up being assigned as legal defense counsel for an individual. Usually there were small infractions, nothing really serious. We also were orphanage supporters. Oh, yeah, let's take a picture. I'll take you back a second. A couple of things that I missed here. This is the 100-ton floating crane that I mentioned before. You get a size of this, magnitude of this thing that was on a barge. It could take a tank, a 50-some-odd ton tank, off a freighter and load it onto a barge. It was a huge crane at the time. Another thing that was interesting, one of the things that happened during the time I was floating around in the port, I found out we were unloading a car that LBJ, Lyndon Baines Johnson, our president, donated to the President Park of South Korea, and it was an armored car, and they offloaded it, and I insisted on getting a ride in the car, in a bulletproof car. So there I am, sitting there behind the bulletproof, sitting in the back of the car, and we just rode around in the port there for a few minutes, and so I got a ride in LBJ's car. I thought it was kind of cool. I mentioned the perimeter, the watch duty that I had to do. We had a platoon of guard dogs. Now, I was scared to death of German Shepherds. I'd been bitten by one when I was a child, and the guard dogs were in a guard compound, with a dog compound, and you can see the dogs, and each one was chained to their individual little hut there. Kept them away from each other. They'd kill each other. So they were trained to kill, essentially, and they were managed by Korean support individuals that would take them down to the port facility and march around the perimeter of the warehouses and stuff, so that the South Koreans wouldn't break into our warehouses and steal all the stuff that was in there. So the guard dogs were enormously effective and scared the hell out of me. So I'd go down on duty in my Jeep and go see those guard dogs would start barking at me and scare the hell out of me. So they were really scary. One of the side stories that I like to tell is when they trained the dogs, they would allow us to come up every now and then, and they would put us in pads. They put our arms and legs in pads, and we could go in and let the dogs come attack us and bite our arms and legs. We had these pads and stuff, so that was a cheap thrill, I guess you could say. Scared the hell out of me, but that's how they trained them. I did like dogs, even though I wasn't big on shepherds. I did. These were my two dogs in where I lived. Mogwump and Kimchi were the two names of the dogs. Now, one interesting thing, South Korea, dog was a delicacy. So dogs were utilized in Asia for security and for food. And essentially, it was a delicacy in South Korea. So my dogs would always bark like crazy as soon as a Korean came around, because they had some idea that they might go into a pot somewhere and become food for somebody. But it was banned ultimately 10 years after I was there, but they're not allowed to eat dog anymore. But when I was there, dog was a delicacy. I found that fairly fascinating. When I first got there, I was assigned a hooch. We called it a hooch, which was basically this Quonset hut you can see in the photograph, which is just a steel. You probably have seen these things in the past, but they're basically a steel shell. It's a temporary item, but in the freezing cold of South Korea in the middle of the winter, I just froze my bippy off in those. But that was my initial about a month I was in that location, until I got lucky and one of the field officers' quarters opened up, and I got placed in much better environment with two other lieutenants in this building here, overlooking the Yellow Sea. That was great at night. You could overlook the Yellow Sea from Wamido Island, where I was stationed, and the ships would be out there at night with their lights on, and everything was a really amazing change for me to have big, beautiful views of the ocean and ships at sea and the beaches and stuff like that. So I really had to step up, that's for sure. I mentioned that the Koreans were extremely poor, and I did take some photographs, and this was, you could tell from, this was where they had a market downtown. You could see the broken, beat up old houses, and they would bring produce into the center of town and sell goods, various types of items that they would sell in these marketplaces. But this was typical of what was going on in downtown Inchon. Here's another photograph of it. You can see how poor they were and how they had to live, basic means at the time. It was 15 years after the Korean War, and they were still coming out of it, and they were really poor people, and I saw a lot of poverty when I was there. So those that had jobs with the Army that worked for me were happy to have jobs. There's a real funny one. I couldn't help taking this picture. There's a guy with a bicycle, and he's got a 300-pound pig on the back of the bicycle. Now, how he was able to balance that on the bicycle, I'll never know, but that's the picture. I thought that was pretty good. So he's bringing the pig to market on his bicycle. Now, one thing that we did do on the side was we supported an orphanage, and we chipped in our own hard-earned money to help the children in an orphanage in Inchon, where I was stationed. And there's a picture during Easter. We had a little get-together with the kids and had rabbits and food for them and stuff like that. So it was one of the nice things we did for the community that we were proud of. Some other photographs which are kind of interesting, in Seoul, which was the capital of Korea, which is about an hour away from Inchon, was the 8th Army Motor Pool. The 8th Army Motor Pool were all the sedans, where all the big shot, high-ranking generals and colonels and everything. They had all their private sedans up there, but because it was run by the Transportation Corps, and I knew who the lieutenant was that was in charge of the motor pool, I could always get a sedan sent to me if I wanted to go on a little trip into Seoul for a day off or whatever. So I could always get a car sent out with a driver and pick me up, so I could feel like a big shot for the day. So that was the 8th Army Motor Pool. So it's called being connected, that's for sure. This is an example of the terrain. South Korea has basically a mountain range that comes down the middle of it called the Taebaek Mountains. And on the western side of the mountains, there are all the flat areas where they raised rice and had agriculture. In the middle, it was all too mountainous for that kind of thing. But here's an example of plowing the fields with an oxen to set it up for rice. I did do tours up into the mountains. One of our jobs was to supply water to these remote locations. This was in an area called Chuncheon, north of Chuncheon, and this was up closer to the demilitarized zone, where we had a Hawk missile battery up on top of this mountain, and our trucks would bring, they were water trucks that Koreans would drive up to the top of the mountain and supply water to a tank up on top of the mountain. I was told, I never went there in the wintertime, but I went up here in this picture in my Jeep. I was told in the wintertime we'd lose a couple of trucks every winter. They'd fall off the cliff and these guys would get killed, unfortunately, supplying water up to the Hawk missile batteries, but that's how desperate things were. In a tour up to the demilitarized zone, I went up through there was a tank battalion that was doing exercises, firing their weapons into the side of a mountain. And here's an example of a cavalry unit that was had a tank. So we were supplying them with all their equipment, their ammunition, their tanks, and all that. So it felt real good that we were doing our part to support the effort that was up in the demilitarized zone. That kept the bad guys up on their side of the demilitarized zone. Now the 38th parallel, which I mentioned in my first picture, where was that? I'm getting messed up. Hold on, can you stop it a sec?
Sure.
Just tell me when you want to start.
Go ahead.
Okay. Now?
Yeah.
Okay, we're on. Back to going north from where I was inspecting the tank battalion. It was up close to the 38th parallel. 38th parallel was north of Inchon. That's this line here. And the North Koreans are above it, and we were below it. And the DMZ is basically the 38th parallel. That's the dividing line between the two countries, and basically is totally mined. It's where all our infantry and armor is up there to protect us from another invasion by the North Koreans. Interestingly enough, where I was in Inchon, we did get attacked a couple of times by sea, because as you can notice, it was only 20 miles south of the demilitarized zone, and the North Koreans would come down in gunboats and shoot up the town with their machine guns off their gunboats, and the South Koreans would go out in their gunboats, and there'd be a night duel usually. This didn't involve myself because it was all Navy work, but there would be quite a scary time when all that was going on. But they did have attacks because we were so close to the North Korean border. The last photo that I have is a picture of the demilitarized zone that I visited at one point, just north of where those tanks were training. And this is the road that goes across to Pemmican, where the negotiations go on. All of the area in that field in that river beyond that you're looking at is all mined, and it's all no man's land essentially. So nobody goes there unless they want to get blown up or they're trying to sneak back and forth, which was going on periodically. There were incursions and by the North Koreans. So that's the demilitarized zone. That's what it looked like. So I spent my second year essentially of active duty in Inchon, Korea, and when my tour got finished, I spent a month in Seoul, and then I was flown back to the west coast of the U.S. At Fort Lewis, Washington, to what they call DROS, or get out of active duty. And I was, frankly, this was brought a chip on my shoulder, because when I came back, I flew into Yokohama from Korea, and we picked up half the plane load going back to the States. Was a plane load of guys coming back from Vietnam, and this was 1971. And they looked like hell. They'd been right out of the jungle and had just been shipped back. And I, again, thank my lucky stars that I didn't have to go over to that place. Anyway, the plane was loaded with them, and they all came back to Fort Lewis, Washington, and were discharged from the active duty at that time at Fort Lewis. And one of the things that just horrified me at the time when we were getting out was we were told in the debriefing that we should not wear our uniforms when we went home, because somebody might spit on us or attack us on our way to home. So it was quite a change from World War II to have experienced something like that. And I never forgot it, and I swore, and that's why I'm involved in the helping veterans today, that I would pay it forward in some way and never stop serving. So that's what was going on in 1970. So then, after the war, briefly, I spent 40 years in civilian life. With my military experience, I was able to obtain a GI Bill and go to graduate school. I got a master's in business at the University of Tennessee in Knoxville, and I majored in both transportation and marketing, and went on to have 8 different jobs in civilian life. But I always was able to springboard my experiences both in leadership and transportation experience and logistics to get some of these civilian jobs after I'd gotten a master's degree working in the Northeast. So subsequent to that, I've volunteered when I retired 14 years ago. I've now been working in the Veterans Memorial Center here in the library with you wonderful folks. I'm part of the museum, the library. I'm also a member of the Military Officers Association of Cape Canaveral. I'm on the board of directors of the Good Deeds Foundation, which raises money for veterans, active duty, and ROTC programs in Brevard County. I'm in the Veterans Back to Class program, where we go and do programs with ROTC programs in the high schools and junior highs. And I'm also a member of the Sons of American Revolution and the Florida Historical Society. So I've been keeping myself very busy after retirement. So that's my story. Any questions?
Yes, I have a few.
Okay.
What would you say is the best part of your service?
What
was the best part of that experience?
Best part of that experience was just the enormity of the experience, especially in Korea, where I had so many wonderful people working for me at such a young age to have that much responsibility. I'd been actually told by my father that you'll never have as much responsibility in civilian life as you will in the military, and it was so true. Imagine having over 100 people working for you and the responsibility of millions of dollars worth of equipment, and all of that falls on your shoulder at the age of 23. Yeah. You just don't get that kind of responsibility in civilian life, so that was the big thrill for me.
Doug, was it hard to readjust to civilian life?
No, I didn't really have a problem.
No.
I didn't, I found a lot of idiocy going back to graduate school and seeing all the undergrads running around smoking dope and all that kind of stuff that they did at the time. But, I was pretty buttoned up, and I knew what I wanted to do. And I made my decision that I didn't want to make a career out of the military. I wanted to get into a civilian job. I wound up ultimately managing director at JP Morgan Asset Management, and we were pension fund advisors for corporations and state pension funds, managing real estate all over the country. So I had a pretty heady job when I worked my way up to that level, and I give the military the credit for having trained me as a great leader. And I hadn't mentioned, but I had I'd been given a Army Commendation Medal by my colonel in my battalion, and so I did a good job. I felt I did a great job and got a medal for it, and I was pretty proud of that.
So the way that service changed, is there major ways, or a major way or major ways that the service changed you? You're talking about leadership. Did it teach you to be a leader?
Just that made me a hell of a lot more mature, and you got a much bigger picture of what's going on in the world, and made you really proud to be an American, and happy to get home, and happy that you didn't get killed in a war, and you made the best of your life. I ultimately got married, wonderful wife, 3 boys, and 4 grandchildren now, all married, all doing well, made good citizens out of everybody. I think that's a lot of what came out of the military for me.
Did your service time, Doug, and I know you're still serving in a way, did it impact your feelings about war and the military in general? Did it change it from before you went in?
No, just the only, having been a product of World War II, I found that the whole Vietnam War thing that was going on was just an awful thing. I think the politicians should have gotten us out a lot sooner. It was just a mess over there. We were getting 50,000 some odd guys killed, and I thought that was pretty horrible. I thought it was particularly horrible that the population in the United States turned against the military instead of turning against the politicians and making us get out of the war ultimately. In fact, I was lucky because Richard Nixon, when he was made president, his platform had been to get us out of the war, and he did, in fact, do that. In fact, I got home earlier. My tour in Korea got cut by 3 months because of his efforts to draw down the military in Vietnam, and we got sucked into that from the Korean experience.
Yeah, what message would you like to leave for future generations who view or hear this interview?
I think that military experience, my view is that military experience is a great experience for everybody. I mean, no one wants to get shot at, but I think the military is a great experience. In a sense, everybody in this country should spend 2 years serving their country in some way. So I think if I have a chip on my shoulder about it, I think everybody should serve their country so that they're contributing to the effort that has made this country the great country that it is. And it's worth fighting for, and it's worth preserving, and it's worth serving in one way, shape, or form, if not the military, certainly in some other capacity. So I think that's my message for everybody.
Final question: is there anything you'd like to add to what that you wanted to cover in the interview?
No, I think I feel proud about what I did. I feel that we did a great job in the military. There's all kinds of issues, of course, but I'm afraid for our country. I'm afraid to see what's going on now, turning against the police force in the same way they did turn against the military at the time. Makes no sense to me. I mean, we need to have a good police force, and so I think people are misguided by all that kind of stuff.
Well, Doug, on the behalf of Joe, myself, the Veterans Memorial Center, we'd like to thank you for what I consider an inspirational story.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it. Thank you.
That's a good interview.